Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you all keeping well. So today's video is part 4 of Richard I, the final part. If you haven't seen the previous 3 videos, do go ahead and watch those first. Otherwise this one won't make much sense to you. But enough blabbing. Let's just get into it. Let's do it. It's been nearly 2 years since Richard set off for the Third Crusade, and the Plantagenet Empire desperately need their king back. In England, during Richard's absence, Richard's little brother John has set himself up as a king in waiting. From the moment Richard set sail for the Holy Land, he has a big court and lots of troops and is basically telling everyone Richard's not returning. But before Richard left, he named his 4-year-old nephew, Arthur of Brittany, as his successor, not John. And now to top it off, Richard's half-brother Geoffrey has arrived in England. Geoffrey, also a troublemaker. Now, during his father's reign, he wielded a lot of power. And just like John, he too thinks he should have a go at running the country. But once Geoffrey arrived in England, he's told he's not welcomed and to basically bugger off. Now, during Richard's absence from England, he'd put a man named William Longchamp, who was the Chancellor of England, to run the government for Richard. Now, William Longchamp was trusted to keep the kingdom together whilst Richard was away on crusade. In October 1191, Longchamp was hounded out of the office by bishops and barons, and there's 2 men leading a hate campaign against him. And those 2 men, John and Geoffrey. Although told to not so politely to leave England, Geoffrey didn't listen. Geoffrey arrived in England saying he wanted the profits of his archbishop's office when he arrived at Dover. Now, Geoffrey was told that if he didn't turn and leave, he would be arrested by the constable of Dover Castle, who just happens to be Longchamp's brother. Geoffrey, he doesn't want to be arrested, but he doesn't want to leave either. So he heads over to one of Dover's monasteries and takes refuge. Now, instead of leaving Geoffrey there, Longchamp sends guards into the church and drags Geoffrey out, kicking and screaming. And it reminds people of what happened to Thomas Becket, although Geoffrey wasn't killed. John has been targeting Longchamp from the beginning. Although it wasn't particularly difficult, William Longchamp was good at running the country, but he was also very good at getting people's backs up. Longchamp was from a lowly background from Normandy, much like Thomas Becket, and in also other similarities to Thomas Becket, Longchamp loved fine clothes and grand processions, and he had a lot of attendants. And he treated those around him very high-handedly, and he made enemies very easily. So John, now all set up as a king in waiting, in September 1191 with a big court and all of those troops following him around, and he has a willing ear to listen to anyone who has a complaint about Longchamp. So John and his henchman, a churchman named Hugh Nonon, has been spreading awful, scandalous stories about Longchamp, and everything just escalates when John's half-brother Geoffrey arrived. The damage to Longchamp's reputation is done. The backlash from having Geoffrey forcibly removed from the church is so vicious that he feels for his safety. Now, according to Hugh Nonon, Longchamp disguised himself as a woman wearing a long green dress, fleeing for his safety. By October that same year, William Longchamp has left England. Now, John thinks He's in charge. But he has a nasty shock come in. When Richard and Eleanor was informed of what was happening by William Longshamp's messengers, Richard sent a trusted advisor, the Bishop of Beauvais, to England to sort things out and to take control of England if needed. And that's exactly what he does. And it sends John into a fit of rage. And John does something really, really stupid. John teams up with the recently returned King Philip Augustus. Philip, seeing England in turmoil and John want to be the big boss man, Philip begins plotting. Philip invites John to Normandy, and there's rumours spreading that Philip is going to offer John a deal. He's going to propose that he recognises John as overlord to the Plantagenet lands in France if John agrees to ditch his heiress that Richard had him married to and marries Philip's sister Alice, who was Richard's former fiancée, instead. Now, John is all ready to sign on that dotted line. He's ready, he's gunning for it. But when one person who has the good sense steps in, his mother. Eleanor has been keeping an eye on the trouble in England from afar, and she can see exactly what Philip is doing. And if John agrees to Philip's proposal, he will be accepting Philip as his supreme lord. To most of the Plantagenet Empire, it will be a disaster for the whole family. Eleanor quickly and firmly puts John back in his place, and John backs down for now. Messengers rush to the Holy Land to tell Richard that if there's any chance he can come back, he should do it now, or John and Philip will see to it that there's nothing for him to come back to. But by the time the messengers reach Richard, he's ready. He's fought Saladin and he's sick and tired. In the autumn of 1192, he's fought Saladin and he's ready. He's done. He wants to go home. And he wants to get home to show John and Philip who's boss. Richard leaves, hoping to be back in England by the new year. But that doesn't go to plan. Richard sets sail dangerously late. Now, Richard gets from Jerusalem to Corfu okay. But by then it's December and it's full on winter, and no one would usually brave the winter seas. But when Richard is in Corfu, he gets word what his little brother is up to, and Richard can't afford to wait. So Richard makes the risky decision that he can't go home via Sicily, so he's having to go for land somewhere around Venice. And from there on foot and horseback until he's back into the safety of Plantagenet territory. Now, Richard leaves his ships and sends them back to England the long way round. And he then hires a few smaller ships to take him and a few trusted companions north. In the winter, the Adriatic Sea is a perilous place to sail. There's flash storms, heavy rain and strong winds, and waves of up to 6 meters high are well known. And in December 1192, that's exactly what Richard experiences. So after taking a real battering from the sea, Richard and his men are driven ashore somewhere around Venice, and the ships are smashed. Richard and his companions, they disguise themselves as peasants and set off for their long hike. But soon enough, they're spotted and they're hunted down by a force sent by the local lord called Meinhart. Meinhard of Gurz. Now, Meinhard, he wasn't a fan of Richard, because Richard was rumoured to have Meinhard's family members assassinated, and Meinhard's men chased them, catching up with Richard's men. There's a bit of a fight, and a few of Richard's men is killed. Now, Richard manages to escape, and the road ahead goes straight into Leopold of Austria's territory. Beyond those is friendly land, but to get there he has to go through Leopold's lands. So they grit their teeth, and Richard and his remaining men, in their peasant disguises, set off. But soon enough, suspicion is raised, and they quickly become marked men. December the 21st, 1192, they're hiding out in a village near Vienna. One of Richard's men goes out to get some food, but he's recognised by one of Leopold's men. Richard is tracked down, and he's found hiding and captured in Vienna. He's then taken to Leopold of Austria, who sends him to nearby Notam Castle. I hope I pronounced that right. Now, Leopold sends word to the German Emperor Henry VI. Henry VI also has very little love for Richard and takes him as prisoner. Henry then writes to King of France in a letter dated the 28th of December 1192. He announced to Philip, and by extension the whole of Europe, Richard was under arrest for, quote, the treason, treachery and mischief for which he had been guilty of the Holy Land. Quote. Richard is behind bars, and that is music to the ears of King John, the German Emperor, and Richard's little brother John. Richard has been in prison since December 1192. It is now summer of 1193, and Richard VI, the German Emperor, is holding Richard ransom for 100,000 silver marks. Richard writes letters back to England asking for the churches and monasteries' gold and wool. Wool was worth a lot of money, all to go towards his ransom. And he is asking everyone to dig very deep into their pockets. Now, Richard's mother, Eleanor, is doing everything she can to get her son home. She is sending Richard the names of everyone who pays forward and how much. Richard says it's to know how much to pay back when he is released. Now, Richard, he's very lucky. He has some strong allies helping him. Now, it may not be easy for Richard being the King of England behind bars, but it's not really easy for the one keeping the king behind bars either. Henry VI, the German Emperor, is the boss of a huge amount of territory that stretches through Central Europe. That's now modern Italy. Henry also wants to be king of Sicily. The position of emperor is elected, and they're very prone to rebellions. And in 1193, Henry is dealing with two big rebellions. He's also trying to build a military campaign to get the crown of Sicily. Now, what Henry really needed was a war chest. Now, during the whole Third Crusade, Richard was there throwing money around and being flashy about it. By taking Richard as prisoner, Henry's putting himself in trouble with the Pope. The Pope authorised crusades, and all crusaders had their property protected by the guarantee of the church whilst they're crusading. And it wouldn't look good if the Pope just simply stood by whilst the leader of the Third Crusade is locked up. Henry has to justify what he is doing, which is why Henry is spreading the word that Richard is a war criminal. And Henry is going to put him on trial. And the accusations against Richard include betraying the crusade by making a deal with Saladin, having high-ranking Christian politicians in the Holy Land assassinated, and anything else Henry can think of. So Richard knows that Henry couldn't have him killed, and he knows his worth. And if Henry kills him or keeps him locked up, Henry wouldn't see a single penny of Richard's ransom money. Which means at some point Henry will have to negotiate and accept a deal. Now Richard has to let Henry figure that out all for himself whilst he finds the ransom money. Easter 1193, the German Emperor Henry VI puts Richard on trial at the imperial court, and there's thousands at the imperial court, and Henry VI, he's the judge. Among the thousands, there's a few familiar faces for Richard. There's William Longchamp, Hubert Walter, who was a fellow crusader and churchman who Richard made the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Eleanor and John aren't there, but against all the odds, Richard, he's loving every second. He's the centre of attention, and he's going to show everyone that you can lock him up, but you can't squash him. And Richard, well, he already knows the outcome. The trial is a performance, and Richard's the performer. The German emperor accuses Richard that he betrayed the crusade, but Richard responds with a captivating story all of his own. When the emperor puts to him that he wasn't the greatest ally to King Philip Augustus, Richard says he doesn't know what the problem is, except that he's probably jealous that Richard's more successful. When Richard is accused of ordering the murder of Conrad of Montferrat, Richard says, if I want to kill someone, I'd pick up my sword and do the job myself. At the end of the trial, which should have been an ordeal, Richard comes out triumphant. All he has to do is hand over the ransom money, which Henry has raised. He's raised the ransom to 150,000 silver marks. He also wants 50 fighting ships and 200 knights on loan for a year so he can finally conquer Sicily. He also wants Richard to formally resign the English crown to be handed it back as a vassal state of the German Empire. This will mean England will be part of the German Empire and the German Emperor can overrule Richard. By the summer, Richard and Henry has agreed on all their terms. All Richard needs to do now is wait for the emergency tax collectors in England to do their work, and they deliver. Thanks to all the hard work of his mother Eleanor and Hubert Walter. They've pulled together enough of the money that Henry's agreed to formally release Richard in the new year. Now there's two people who isn't overly keen on seeing Richard released. Richard's brother, John, and of course the King of France, Philip Augustus. Now the two were so keen on keeping Richard locked up that they were willing to outbid whatever he could raise. Henry the Sixth would throw away the key. When word reaches them that Henry isn't going to do no such thing, Philip dashes off a note to John, telling him to look to yourself. The devil is loose. On December the 26th, 1194, Leopold of Austria goes out riding one winter's day with a few of his knights, almost 2 years till the day that he captured Richard the Lionheart and sold him to the German Emperor Henry VI. And Leopold, he received a decent payout from Richard's ransom payments. He'd also forced Richard into granting a marriage in the family to a wealthy Plantagenet heiress who arrived just before Christmas and is due to marry Leopold's son. Now, as Leopold and his knights ride through his lands, Leopold, who was a very experienced rider, but somehow his horse either stumbles or is frightened, he throws Leopold off and he hits the ground hard, and then his horse falls on top of him. Now his men quickly scramble back to him and eventually manage to free him from under his horse. Now Leopold is screaming in agony, and his men soon see why. Leopold's leg is badly mangled, so much so bone is poking out of the skin. Leopold is picked up and taken back to his palace. His doctors are sent for, and they do their best in putting the bone back in place and dressing the wound. Now, I must warn you, if you are a bit queasy, maybe fast forward a little bit or cover your ears. By the morning, when the doctors return, Leopold is feverish and his foot is black. Infection has got in. Now, Leopold, who's in absolute agony, is told that either lose your leg or lose your life. Leopold tells them to amputate his foot, but his doctors won't do it. So Leopold tells one of his men to fetch him an axe and a mallet. Leopold places the axe just over the break in his leg and gives one of his men the mallet and tells him to hit the axe hard. Reluctantly, the man strikes. He strikes the axe once, twice, and then finally Leopold's foot eventually comes off. After 5 days in agony, Leopold dies. As death was nearing Leopold, he confessed his sins, and on the 31st of December, Leopold ordered that Richard be paid back everything he had taken for him. For Leopold, there's no resting straight away. For what Leopold had done to Richard, the Pope excommunicated him, and there was not a single Austrian churchman who would dare perform the funeral, and he was finally lifted 8 days later. Leopold was finally laid to rest. When one English chronicler hears the news, he said that it was proof that God crushes the proud, that he might manifest his powers to mortals. Richard was released in 1194, almost a year after being imprisoned. Those who crossed Richard are panicked. Leopold of Austria, he's already had his comeuppance. But what about John and Philip? While Richard was locked away, John had set himself up as a king in waiting, ignoring that Richard had chosen his 4-year-old nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who was their brother Geoffrey's son, as his successor, and deciding to team up with King Philip Augustus. Philip, he saw John as a weak and easily led, and Philip just kept getting the better of John throughout 1193. Philip played along, and John, wow, he sent armies into Normandy and Aquitaine, taking vital castles. John's response was just to keep handing everything over to Philip in the hopes that he would rule what was left. John gave half of Normandy away to the French king. He'd also surrendered vital border fortresses in Anjou and Aquitaine. John, he made agreements with rebellious lords, granting them their freedom from Plantagenet rule if they promised not to cause him any trouble. And then to top it off, he asked Philip to join him in bribing the German emperor to keep Richard imprisoned indefinitely. John and Philip, their payback's going to be a bitch. Which of these, Richard was formally released on March the 4th, 1194, and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was there to meet him. But Richard goes to the church of the city of Cologne to celebrate his freedom, and from there he goes on a cruise, sailing around Flanders for a week. Richard is fully aware that Philip Augustus has troops in around Normandy, and his little brother John is on the loose, yet Richard seems to be in no rush to return. Richard finally makes it to England on the 13th of March, when he's given a hero's welcome. He gives thanks once again, but this time at the shrine of Thomas Becket. It quickly becomes clear that none of Richard's menacing reputation has gone. One of many castles being controlled by John's allies in England is the fortress on the island of St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. Now, that's around 350 miles away from where Richard landed in Kent. It's almost impossible to attack. But when the man holding the fortress hears that Richard is back, he's so scared, it was said that he died of fright. John's forces also hold Notam Castle. Now, the garrison there thinks that they can hold the castle, and it's going to take a lot more than just hearing Richard's name to scare them off, although not much more. Richard turns up late March, accompanied by knights fully dressed in armour. Richard challenges them to come out and fight, and they accept that challenge, and they do fight, and Richard wins easily, and a few men are captured, and Richard hangs them in full view of the castle walls. The castle surrenders. After that, word quickly gets around. Those holding castles for John gives them up and asks for Richard's mercy. By mid-April, England is back under Richard's rule, and as for John, John is reported to have been in Europe, somewhere following Philip Augustus. Richard reveals to his council that was thought to have been a cruise on his release was in fact a military scouting exercise, looking at the territory that's important to Philip and the places in Normandy that John has given away. Richard is busy planning his revenge. Now, on the Sunday after Easter, The Sunday after Easter, April the 17th, Richard arranges for a great ceremony to be held in Winchester Cathedral. Now, the ceremony is called a crown wearing. Now, it's not so much a coronation, but more of a reminder that Richard is the boss. Now Richard, he summons the King of Scots, William the Lion, to attend as his guest of honour. Richard also ensures that his mother, Eleanor, is playing a prominent role in the service and having the ceremony in Winchester, the ancient capital city, and close to a new military port that Richard wants to develop on the south coast, Portsmouth. Now, Portsmouth is going to be his new naval base and a jumping off place to reconquest the lands that John has given away. In May, Richard has 100 ships ready and they're full of men, horses, weapons and supplies. All Richard needs to know now is where his little brother is and what to do with John once he finds him. Richard arrives in Barfleur in the summer of 1194 and is welcomed with huge crowds. King Philip Augustus has done major damage to Normandy. He's snatching castles and lands, all while being helped by John. When Richard steps off the ship, people are rushing to him and giving him gifts. William Marshall's biographer wrote, quote, "He had folk dancing and tripping gracefully around him all the time, so that he took no step on road or over field without having all around him such a great, dense, overpowering crowd of joyous people that could not have thrown an apple in the air and seen it land." Now, Richard's ego has been boosted, but he has big problems in the time Richard has been away. Philip Augustus has been very busy. He's snatched up almost half of Normandy. He's stirred up big trouble in Aquitaine and is threatening the heartland of the empire in Anjou. Many of Richard's men have been wavering their support and is wondering if to throw it all in with Philip instead. Richard has to prove that he's the rightful ruler, but it's going to take a lot of effort. But before any of that, Richard has to show how he deals with people who betray him. And the biggest traitor was his little brother John. And it won't take Richard long to hunt him down, but he still doesn't know what to do with him once he finds him. Now, Richard could take John's lands and titles and throw him in jail, as it was a taste of his own medicine. Hanging, drawing and quartering hasn't been invented yet. That won't be around for another 90 years. But Richard could throw John off a very tall tower or stab him with many sharp implements. No one would really blame him. Richard knows his little brother very well. And when things get too hot, John melts under the heat. When Richard was in jail and John was stirring up all kinds of problems, Richard said, "My brother John isn't a man to win lands by force if there is anyone to oppose him." Richard was basically calling John a coward. So Richard could do all of those things and no one would have blamed him. But if Richard killed John, the political fallout would be enormous. So after landing in Barfleur, Richard plans to stay a few nights in a grand house of one of his supporters. But Richard is suffering from insomnia. And when a messenger comes saying that his cowardly little brother John has come out of hiding to find Richard, it perks him up. John has been in a town called Evra. I really hope I pronounced it right. Apologies if I haven't. Now, it used to be Plantagenet territory before Philip claimed it. Now, John leaves it to come to make peace with Richard. John shows up with his tail between his legs, hoping that by going to Richard, the punishment won't be as severe. Now, Richard puts his plan into action. Richard summons John. William Marshall's biographer wrote, quote, "Trembling with fear, John came before the king and fall at his feet. But the king lifted his brother by the hand and kissed him, saying, 'John, have no fear. You are a child, and you had bad men looking after you. Those who thought to give you bad advice will get their just deserts. Get up now and go and eat.'" John, he wanders off, goes to find out what's to eat. Turns out it's salmon that was gifted by one of Richard's well-wishers. So you might be thinking, well, what sort of punishment's that? I want to go into a whole lot more than that. But it was those words. You were a child. And the wrong things, John, can I just point out that John was 27 years old? Days after getting one up on John, Richard sets out on taking the war to Philip Augustus. Richard's first stop is the Castle of Feny in the borderlands of Normandy and France. Now, the castle is Richard's, but Philip has it under siege, and the garrison there is getting very desperate. A messenger has managed to get to Richard, begging him for help. Philip has siege machines and smashing the outer defences, and stones are being hurled, and Philip's troops have them cut off from the food supply. The men inside are being taunted, but they're not going down without a fight. On the wooden gates, they've drawn an insulting cartoon of Philip and goading him about his inability to smash them down, but they can't hold out much longer. Now, a big section of the wall has come down, and Richard needs to get there before Philip completely takes over the castle. Richard needs to work out the best way to save Feny. If he goes in head first into battle, he's risking many casualties. And this is one of many battles to come. Richard has brought 100 ships from Portsmouth with him, but a sneaky approach is needed. Richard splits his force in half. One half is sent to break through Philip's lines, and if they get in the castle, the defenders will have some much needed support. They find the weakest position and they get inside. Richard leads the rest of his men on a long ride all the way around. Philip's defenders keep themselves out of sight until they get to the rear of Philip's forces. Now, once there, they take aim at the supply lines that keep the men fed and watered, and it weakens them almost immediately. But that doesn't earn Richard's victory. That is his secret weapon. John. Yeah. Remember that little town I told you, Evra, where John was hiding at? It was once Plantagenet, but it flipped sides. So as Richard goes to Feny, John goes back to Evra with some troops, and the French garrison is so pleased to see John back, having no idea what happened between the two brothers. John suggests that they have a meal to celebrate his return. All of them together when the garrison sits down to eat with John, he gives a signal. His troops rush into the room and slaughters the French garrison, every single one. The town is Plantagenet once again. The massacre is what Richard needed. Philip is at Feny, and when he hears of what happened at Evra, he takes some of his forces, and whilst over there, by the time Philip gets there, John has scarpered. And the French take out their anger on the city by burning the churches and destroying the holy relics. Back at Feny, Philip's men had been told to stay in their posts whilst the king deals with Evra, but they don't obey their orders for very long. Less than 24 hours after Philip rode off, his troops desert Feny, and Richard has won. But there's still a long way to go. In Normandy, 1196, Richard oversees the building work of a huge castle on top of a cliff overlooking the River Seine. The castle will command the Seine Valley and the borderland between Rouen and Paris, the area known as the Vexin. The castle is going to be massive. It has rings of fortifications around its central towers. It's going to have holes where boiling oil or sand can be tipped down onto enemies if they get too close. And the castle will be able to hold hundreds of troops and be connected to the river port of Ordelay. I hope that's right. So supplies can get in. For the massive castle to be built, it would usually take up to 10 years. Richard has planned for it to be finished in 2. He has blown his budget twice over, and he's building it illegally on land that is supposed to be demilitarized. Now, Richard named the castle Chateau Girard, I really hope that's right, meaning saucy castle. So when construction was underway, it rained red. Now, many believed it was a sign from God that blood was being spilled. One by one, Richard was getting back the castles and lands that Philip Augustus had taken from him. In late September 1198, after the great castle of Richard's was built, Richard rides to the Vexin with 200 knights and several thousand foot soldiers, heading for Gisors. Now, Richard quickly takes back castles that were loyal to Philip. Richard is informed that Philip is on his way with a larger army. Now, Richard, he climbs on top of a hill to watch the French army approach. Despite Philip's army being larger, Philip's men spread out around the countryside. Now, Richard decides to charge. William Marshall's biographer, now William Marshall, who wasn't actually there at the time, but his biographer wrote, "The king said, 'God is with us, let us attack them.' He immediately rode at them just as a ravenous lion starved of food runs at its prey and finds it seeking for nothing else but the moment when it can catch up with it." End quote. Now Philip, seeing Richard charge at them, chickens out. He's not in the mood for a fight now, and he runs to the castle of Gisors, and Richard's still hot on his heels. Now Philip managed to get away thanks to a dust cloud. But for Philip to get into Gisors, Philip and his army has to cross a bridge over the River Epte. But the stampede of the men escaping Richard Too many cram themselves onto the bridge at once, and the bridge collapses under their weight. Dozens of knights and Philip himself ends up in the river. Philip is pulled out by his royal clerk and servants, making it to safety, but not all were so lucky. Around 20 French knights drowned, and 91 were taken prisoner and taken back to Richard's spanking brand new castle and held there for ransom. It was an embarrassing defeat for Philip, and he's had enough. Philip needs some time out, so at Christmas in 1198, a representative of the new Pope, Pope Innocent III, arrives in France, and Philip asks the representative to get Richard to agree to a ceasefire, stating that they should make up and join forces and go on another crusade to recover Jerusalem. Sounds familiar? Richard is angry. He said it was Philip's fault why he had to come back from Jerusalem in the first place, and Philip conspired to keep Richard in prison for as long as possible, and Richard drives some hard terms for a truce. He'll only leave Philip alone if he can keep everything he's won back. And Philip accepts. In the early new year, Richard and Philip meet up on the banks of the River Seine. Well, not actually meet up as such. They refuse to go anywhere near each other. Richard stayed on a riverboat and Philip sat on his horse on land. The peace deal is discussed and they part. And that would be the last time they'll ever see each other. It's March 1199 and Richard has been fighting to win back his lands for nearly 5 years. He's now at Châlus-Chabril. I really hope I pronounced that right. In Aquitaine, and he's fighting an ally to Philip, who isn't protected by the peace deal, which was made with Philip. The Count of Limoges, again, I hope that's right, has been a thorn in Richard's side. There's no siege engines. There's no battles. It's a simple crossbow fight. Now, Richard, he's among his men fighting as usual. And in the evening, Richard, he finishes his dinner and he goes back out into the fighting, but he doesn't put on his armour. He doesn't need that for a simple crossbow fight. No. He just, puts on his helmet. Things are looking good at taking over the castle. And there's one single defender up on the battlement. He's daring Richard. And Richard, he loves a challenge. Now the defender has a crossbow and a frying pan that he's using as a shield. Richard, he's impressed. And he gives the crossbow man a round of applause. Richard, he lowers himself behind his shield as the defender shoots. But Richard isn't quick enough. The bolt hits Richard's left shoulder and it buries itself deep inside his flesh. Richard tells a few trusted men what's happened. He has a look at his shoulder as he manages to get the wooden shaft out of his shoulder. Now the iron tip remains inside, which was not really surprised as the arrow and bolt heads were attached loosely, so the wooden shaft to the wooden shaft on purpose, so they would get stuck inside whoever they shot. Now Richard, he needs a surgeon, and the surgeon slices open Richard's shoulder and starts digging around. Now the lamps are dim, it's dark outside, making it very difficult to see, and there's a lot of shoulder to dig around in, and it takes the surgeon a while to get the tip out. Now by the time he does, the wound is looking horrible. The wound is patched up with ointment and bandages. Now the next few days are crucial. After the surgery, Richard is advised to rest, let his body heal. But Richard decides that the best way to heal is to have several women in his bed with him. After all, he needs to do something to pass the time. But after a few days, his shoulder is checked, and it's not looking good. It's looking gangrenous. Richard knows that he has days at best. Richard sends for his beloved mother Eleanor to be by his side. Eleanor is recorded in the next official charter stating that she had been our son the king's deathbed. Richard, in one last chivalrous act, he had the crossbow man brought to him, and Richard gave the man 100 shillings for serving his lord so faithfully. But Richard's men weren't so forgiving. As soon as their king died, the crossbow man was flayed alive. Richard confessed his sins, and in the evening on April the 6th, 1199, with his mother by his side, Richard the Lionheart died, aged 41. Richard's confessor, Milo, closed Richard's eyes and mouth, and messengers were sent out across France and England announcing the Lionheart's death. Eleanor accompanied Richard's body to Fontevraud Abbey, where he's buried alongside his father, King Henry II. Richard left behind him a Plantagenet empire much more complete than it was in 1194. When he got out of prison, he left most of his enemies either dead or blundered into submission, and he left a legend that remains till this day. Richard the Lionheart, a brutal king for a brutal age. Richard also left behind a final choice for a successor. There's no child of his own. He had an illegitimate son, but he and Berengaria hardly ever saw each other, so no child was ever produced. And it was not his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who he had named as his heir, as he did in Sicily when he joined the crusade. Instead, he now named his 32-year-old little brother John to be his successor. Richard's enemies began to gloat that he got what was coming to him. One chronicler noted that no king in history had taken as much money from his people as Richard, but his supporters outshone his enemies. In one famous passage that was quoted for hundreds of years afterwards, laments his sudden death. Quote, "To our eyes he was light, to our ears he was melody, to our minds and amazement he was the Lord of warriors, the glory of kings, the delight of the world." Now William Marshall wrote, quote, "A man worthy and courtly, bounteous and generous, a man of high enterprise, a conqueror, whom had he lived would have won for himself all the renown in this world. And there is that. There is Richard the First. And quite the story, even though he reigned for 10 years, but he only was in England for 6 months, or around 6 months. And I have to admit, before I'd done all the research on Richard the First, I wasn't really the biggest fan of him. But after doing the research, I actually admire the man. It was an extremely brutal age, and he stood up to that. He raised above that, and in some ways, I like Henry II. I do. I think he was a very, very good, in my opinion. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that is mine. So, and I do think if Richard hadn't died when he did, would he have been better than Henry II? There's that what if question again. Anyway, there's that. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Please do hit that subscribe button and like and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, because I do plan on uploading more. So, but thank you again for watching, and thank you all so much for all your kindness. It means the absolute world, and just keep being you, because you're all wonderful. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.